The community is coming together to remember the two men who were killed in Monday's shooting. We were at last night's vigil outside the library. About 100 people joined together to listen to prayerful songs. It started at the Chico Library. Many people have left flowers and notes there remembering the victims, Jacob Cole Hull and Robert Johnson. This second vigil was held at St. John's Episcopal Church on Floral Avenue in Chico. There were songs and prayers for an end to gun violence. This was a gathering of several faith communities, including Bidwell Presbyterian, Faith Lutheran, and other local congregations.
Robert Johnson got into his car in Orland, California, sometime in the early afternoon of Monday, June 22nd, and he drove the 25 miles east to the town of Chico. He had made that drive hundreds of times, had lived in the small farming community of Orland for around 30 years. He had just retired from a career in farm management. And in his retirement, the thing he had chosen to do, day after day, was drive into Chico and spend his afternoon Labrate County Library. His family would later describe the library as his happy place. Around the same time that Monday afternoon, in the town of Chico itself, a 46-year-old maintenance supervisor at the local Oxford Suites Hotel was picking up a 7-year-old little girl. He was the man who had been raising her for years as a father figure. He had been 46 years old for 2 months. His birthday had been in April. His name was Jacob Cody Hull. The little girl was the niece of his sister's best friend. He read to her. He had brought her to the Chico Library that afternoon to pick out books. By 4:30 in the afternoon, both of them were inside. Robert Johnson was sitting at a table with a book. Jacob Cody Hull and the 7-year-old little girl were choosing what she wanted to take home. Neither of them had ever heard of an 18-year-old Chico High School graduate named Bradley Scott Sayer. And neither. That same afternoon, in a house a few miles away, that 18-year-old was uploading a video to a corner of the internet, telling strangers he was about to go to the Chico Library and shoot as many people as he could. Both of them were dead.
All the units are around Post 3. They have an active shooter at the library, 1108 Sherman Avenue, across the 3rd or Mildred Avenue. They have a male suspect, WMA, all black clothing, long rifle, and he's confirmed 1144 at this time. There's still parties in the library.
This is the story of how investigators in Chico, California, in the 72 hours that followed the most disturbing mass shooting in the town's modern history, pieced together the life of a young man who had been planning what he did for 4 years, of how they walked his journal, his computer, his online accounts, his father's gun closet, and his entire 18-year-old life back through the door he had walked out of that afternoon, and of how, in the end, the men they were investigating for and the man they were investigating had all walked into the same building on the same Monday afternoon, and only one of them had walked back out. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are going to Chico, California, a town of around 100,000 people, set in the agricultural valley about 90 miles north of Sacramento, about 150 miles northeast of San Francisco. Home of California State University, Chico, a public university with an undergraduate population of around 14,000 students. The kind of college town that, on a warm summer afternoon, looks like a postcard. Tree-lined streets, bike lanes, a public library on Sherman Avenue with a green lawn out front, and on the afternoon of Monday, June 22nd, 2026, the scene of one of the most disturbing mass shootings in California in recent memory. This is the case of Robert Johnson, Jacob Cody Hull, and Bradley Scott Sayer. Before we get to what the police found, before we get to the journal, before we get to the 4 years of online posts, you have to know who the two men in that library were. Because the story of what Bradley Sayre did, in the end, the story of what he took from two families. And those two families have spent every day since June 22nd telling the world who those two men actually were. Robert Johnson was 74 years old. He had lived in Orland, a small farming town about 25 miles west of Chico, population around 8,000 for roughly 3 decades. He had built a life there. He had a wife. He had a family. He had spent his career in farm management in the most fertile agricultural valley in the United States. And when he retired, he could have done anything with his time. What he chose to do was read. He had loved books his entire life. In retirement, he had begun splitting his time between his home in Orland and the town of Chico, where his family had begun splitting his time between his home in Orland and the town of Chico, where his family had ties and where the public library at 1088 Sherman Avenue had become, in his family's own. He drove the 25 miles in regularly. He sat at the same kind of table. He picked up the same kinds of books. He was, in the way that small-town American retirees often are, a fixture. The library staff knew him. The other regulars knew him. He was the kind of older man who would smile politely at a stranger and say good afternoon, and then go back to his book. He had been doing exactly that on the afternoon of June 22nd. He had been at his table near the back of the main reading area with the book open in front of him when an 18-year-old he had never met walked in with a shotgun. Jacob Cody Hull was 46 years old. He had grown up in Morro Bay on the central California coast in San Luis Obispo County. He had been living in Chico for years. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at the Oxford Suites Hotel in Chico, a steady, low-key job he had been doing for some time. His brother, Benjamin, would later describe him to reporters as very smart, quiet, low-key. Cody had loved 1990s hip-hop. He had been into sports. He had been academically gifted as a kid. He was the kind of person, his brother said, that you do not get to sum up in 3 sentences. The most important thing Cody Hull had been doing in his life at the time of his death was helping to raise a little girl. The girl was 7 years old. She was the niece of his sister's best friend. The exact family configuration is the kind of thing that does not fit on a Facebook bio. She was not legally his daughter. She was not legally his niece. She was not a relative in the way the law tracks relatives. But she was, for all of the reasons that matter, outside a courtroom, his. He read to her. He took her places. He showed up. He was, in the way the family had come to describe it, her father figure. That afternoon he had taken her to the library to pick out books, specifically the kind of books she loved to have him read to her. They had gone inside. They had chosen a stack. They had walked back out toward the front entrance, and they had sat on a bench just outside the library doors with the books between them. On a warm summer Monday in Chico. There was nothing about that bench, that moment, or those two people that was unusual in any way. That is the part of this case that the families of the 2 men who died have asked the world to hold on to. Both of these men had done absolutely nothing wrong. Both of these men had been doing the things they loved most in their lives. One had driven 25 miles to read a book. The other had taken a child to pick up the next chapter of the stories he was reading to her. Mizipro, on June 22nd, 2026, were either dead or dying because a stranger they had never met had decided, days and weeks and months and years earlier, that he was going to walk into a public building in their town and shoot the first people he saw. That stranger was sitting in his father's house at that moment, recording a video of himself. His name was Bradley Scott Sayre. He was 18 years old. He had graduated from Chico High School 2 weeks earlier. What he was doing was uploading a confession to the internet before he had even committed the crime. The 72 hours after the shooting at the Chico branch of the Butte County Library were, by any measure, one of the most intensive investigative periods the Chico Police Department had ever undertaken. By the morning of Thursday, June 25th, when Bradley Scott Sayer made his first court appearance in the Butte County Superior Court in Oroville, investigators had reconstructed the entire afternoon of June 22nd, the entire life of the 18-year-old who had killed 2 strangers, and the entire online architecture of the community that had fed his fantasy for the 4 years leading up to it. They had done it in 3 days. The first thing they learned was the timeline. On Monday, June 22nd, dispatchers heard gunshots and screaming through the open 911 line. Chico police officers were on the scene within 2 minutes. From the moment of the first 911 call to the moment Bradley Scott Sayer was face down on the asphalt behind the library in handcuffs, less than 4 minutes had passed. That is not a typo. 4 minutes. Chico Police Chief Billy Outrage would tell reporters the next day, when he briefed them on the response, that he wanted the people of Chico to remember that number the next time they wondered if they were safe in a public space.
So, yesterday we had an active shooter incident at the Butte County Library Chico branch. The initial 911 call came in at, now I want you to take specific note of the timeline here. The initial 911 call came in at 5:12 and 58 seconds. The call, as it was open in our dispatch center, the dispatchers could overhear what they described as screaming and gunshots. Several officers were dispatched to a potential active shooter incident there based off what our dispatchers were hearing. Our first officer went on scene at 5:14 and 44 seconds. So our response time was less than 2 minutes. At 5:16 and 53 seconds, we had the suspect in custody. So from time of initial 911 call to and in custody with our suspect was less than 4 minutes. That's absolutely amazing, and I want to acknowledge that. I absolutely believe that this is what mitigated further loss of life to members from our community, and I want to recognize every one of those first responders that responded and handled the situation.
2 of those 4 minutes had been enough for Bradley Sayer to kill 2 people. The second thing investigators learned was what had happened inside the building. Sayer had arrived at the library in his own car. He had parked outside. He had walked inside without a weapon. A walkthrough, the FBI special agent in charge of the Sacramento field office, Sid Patel, would later call it. Sayer had moved through the building. He had looked at where the patrons were. He had looked at where the exits were. He had looked at where the staff were. Then he had walked back out. Patel would later say, in a single sentence at a press conference, that Sayer had been looking for a confined, populated location to attack. The Chico Library that afternoon met the requirements. Sayer had returned to his car, .22 caliber rifles in the trunk. He had taken a 20-gauge pump-action shotgun. He had filled his pockets with shells. He had taken kitchen matches. He had walked back toward the front entrance. The first person he encountered on the bench just outside the doors was Jacob Cody Hull. The 7-year-old little girl was sitting next to him with a stack of books.
I see the gunman with the rifle in hand. It was a like a hunter's rifle, like I said, pointing towards the door right where me and my son were standing.
Ami Hartman says he was visiting the library with his 2-year-old son when he saw the shooter entering the building through the front door. He says he grabbed his son and ran towards a back office.
There were shots being fired as I was running into the office room, and then once we were all, huddled in there waiting for the help to come, there was more shots being fired, probably like 3 to 5 shots during that time as well.
Sayer raised the shotgun and fired at Hull's leg. Hull went down. The little girl saw it. Sayer stepped closer and, with Hull on the ground, fired a second shot at close range into his head. The little girl ran. She ran toward the doors of the library. The shotgun blast had shattered the glass of the entrance. She crawled through the broken glass to get inside, and the broken glass sliced into the side of her abdomen. The injuries, hospital staff would later concede, and the wakened the physical injuries. She had just watched the man who had been raising her as a father be executed in front of her. Sayer walked into the library. Inside, near the back of the main reading area, Robert Johnson was sitting at a table with a book. He had a few seconds, maybe, between the sounds from outside and what happened next. Sayer raised the shotgun and fired one shot. Robert Johnson fell. Sayer fired a second shot into him as he was down. 8 rounds total were fired inside and outside the Chico branch of the Butte County Library that afternoon.
From my understanding, he was preventing the shooter from getting further into the library, and that is what led him to being shot.
The shotgun was a pump action, meaning Sayer had to manually rechamber each shell between shots. Investigators would later observe that he had been loading the weapon 1 shell at a time, taking the shells out of his pants pocket between rounds. He did not, in the DA's assessment, appear fully familiar with the firearm. He did not know how to use the shotgun's magazine tube to load multiple rounds at once. He was, in other words, an 18-year-old who had taken his father's gun out of a closet and brought it to
From my understanding, he was preventing the shooter from getting further into the library, and that is what led him to being shot.
The library staff, and this is a detail that has not gotten the attention it deserves, move with remarkable speed and
Investigators say the gunman is 18-year-old Bradley Sayer. They say he had no known connections to the victims, but after interviewing him, they learned he had been influenced by the Columbine High School shooting.
And the why question has been alluded to by Chief Outrage is that the suspect was a fan and a fan for some time of social media involving Columbine-type shootings, the school shootings, and had unfortunately made a into that social media community and obviously lost his way.
Officials say Sayer is now being held in isolation as they further investigate.
Robert Johnson was on the floor behind him, dead. Cody Hull
Friends of Hull say they will be holding a fundraiser for the victims' families at Noby's and the Cheesesteak Shop this weekend. A candlelight vigil is also planned here at the library tonight at 8 o'clock. As for the suspect, he is expected to be charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree murder for those 2 people who were killed. He will and is expected to be at the Butte County Superior Courthouse for his first court appearance this Thursday afternoon. I'm live in Chico. Roxanne Elias, ABC 10.
Roxanne, any thought in chatting as to why the library was chosen, or was it just a random place where people might be?
For the second time that afternoon, He had stood by his car and decided that two
that's
people
something that
dead was not
they
going to be
didn't
the end of what he
exactly
did that
mention.
day.
What we do know
He
is
had
that
decided
there
that
is
the
no
building
connection to
itself
these
was
two
going to
people who
burn.
were killed.
The matches
I
did
think
not
they
catch.
are looking
The
further into
carpet
some
was
of the
not the right
devices
kind.
of this suspect,
The
and I
books
think
on the
we may be
shelves
able to
nearest
get
to him
some of
did
that
not light.
information
He
coming
kept
up
trying.
later. They're also looking
Strike.
at some of the ring
Watch.
cameras from some of the
Drop.
homes around here, and so
Strike.
we're still waiting for a lot
Watch.
more details to come
Drop.
as they develop.
Officers watching him
Indeed,
through the
and they will
windows
come in. All right,
could not
Roxanne
move on
Elias
him
in
without
Chico.
risk
Roxanne,
of the
thank
patron
you.
still inside. He had a shotgun in his hands, and he was striking matches with a building full of hostages. 22 caliber bullet from the ammunition he had loaded into his pockets back at his father's house. He tried to feed that round into the shotgun he was holding. In 22 round is far smaller than the chamber of a 20 gauge shotgun. The bullet fell straight through the barrel and clattered onto the floor of the library. He was trying to kill himself. He told investigators later that it had been part of the plan from the start. He was going to shoot as many people as he could, set the building on fire, and then put a round into his own head. He had executed the first part of the plan. He had failed at the second. And he did not know the weapon he was holding well enough to do the third. So he stood there in the middle of the Chico Public Library, an 18-year-old in a homemade T-shirt with the bodies of two strangers in the room with him, holding a shotgun he could not load properly, surrounded by police, having failed to start a fire and failed to kill himself, with no plan left. Officers got his attention through the windows. They waved him toward the back doors. He dropped the shotgun on the floor. He walked outside. He ran toward Sherman Avenue. A police officer was right behind him. Another officer cut him off from the side. They tackled him to the ground. The arrest was photographed by a passenger on a Beeline City bus that had stopped near the library. She would later post the photo on social media. It would become one of the defining images of the case. The fourth thing investigators learned was where the guns had come from. Within the first few hours of the investigation, the Chico police, working with the FBI's Sacramento field office, had identified all three of the firearms recovered at the scene. The shotgun on the library floor, 22 caliber rifles in the trunk of Sayer's car. All three were registered. All three came back to the same person, Bradley Sayer's father. Sayer's parents, the investigators learned, had divorced about 4 years earlier, when Sayer was just entering high school. He had been splitting his time between their two homes ever since. His mother did not keep firearms in her home. His father did. On the afternoon of June 22nd, Sayer had been at his father's house, alone, while his father was out of town. Every gun he carried into the Chico Library that afternoon had been taken out of his father's closet by an 18-year-old who had collected his high school diploma 3 weeks earlier. The fifth thing investigators learned was what was in Sayer's bedroom, a journal. It went back about 4 years. It began, roughly, around the time Sayer's parents divorced. Its contents included detailed references to the 1999 Columbine High School shooting in Littleton, Colorado, and to other mass killings Sayer had been studying online. District Attorney Mike Ramsey would tell reporters at a press conference 3 days later that the contents of the journal were, in his word, disturbing. Behavioral health experts were brought in to review it alongside prosecutors. That journal is the gut punch of this case, because it meant the planning was not new. It was not last week. It was not last month. It was 4 years of writing, 4 years of an American teenager filling pages with his thoughts about mass killers and what they had done. 4 years of a journal sitting weeks with his mother. 4 years of pages turned and pages added and pages reread, while he ate dinner downstairs and went to school in the morning and walked across a graduation stage in early June and shook hands with his principal and posed for photos with his family. The sixth thing investigators learned was that Bradley Sayer had not been doing it alone. He had been part of a community, specifically an online community, chat rooms, fan pages, and forums where, according to District Attorney Ramsey, mostly young people collected, traded, and celebrated images and videos and writings from the perpetrators of school shootings and mass killings around the world. The community Saya had immersed himself in most deeply was the one dedicated to the 1999 Columbine shooting. Over the past 25 years, that subculture has become the central reference point of an entire dark corner of the Internet. Young people who treat the two Columbine killers as folk heroes. On Monday, June 22, 2026, 23 minutes before the first 911 call, Bradley Saya had uploaded a video of himself to those fan pages. In the video, he is dressed in a way that he believed mimicked the appearance of one of the Columbine shooters. Black clothing, suspenders, and on top, a plain white T-shirt with 2 words written across it in black marker. Those 2 words were what one of the Columbine shooters wore on his own T-shirt on the day of the 1999 Akang, a phrase the Columbine killer had appropriated from a dehumanizing worldview that treated his victims as biologically inferior. The phrase has, in the 25 years since, become a symbol within the school shooter fan subculture online. Saya told the people watching the video that he intended to go to the Chico Library and shoot as many people as he could. Then he had driven to the library and done exactly that. The FBI began drafting federal search warrants for the online platforms Saya had been posting in. Federal authorities are still working their way through that material as of this recording. The 7th thing investigators learned was who Bradley Scott Saya had been before any of this. By the end of the 72 hours, they had spoken to his classmates, his teachers, his neighbors, and his family. They had assembled a picture that almost every person who had spoken about him publicly had agreed on. He was 18 years old. He had been born and raised in Chico. He had been an academic standout at Chico High School, taking advanced placement classes and dual enrollment courses at California State University, Chico. While still finishing his senior year, he had been described in the words of the DA as friendly but shy. Classmates who spoke to local reporters had used the same phrases over and over. He kept to himself. He was a good guy. He was quiet. They had no idea. He had been diagnosed with autism. And somewhere in the 4 years between his parents' divorce and his graduation, he had walked into a corner of the Internet that had walked him back out wearing a shirt with 2 words written on Thursday afternoon, June 25th, 2026, 3 days after the shooting. Bradley Scott Saya was driven from the Butte County Jail in Oroville to a courtroom in the same building for his first court appearance. He was 18 years old. He walked into the courtroom in shackles. He was dressed in yellow long-sleeved jail clothing and gray sweatpants. Reporters and family members of the victims were seated in the gallery. Cameras were rolling, and as he stepped into view, Bradley Saya made a hand gesture at his waist. It was the gesture that, over the past several years, has been adopted within certain corners of the online far right as a coded symbol of white supremacy. The thumb and forefinger touching to form a circle, the other 3 fingers raised. To a casual observer, it can look like the standard OK sign. To the audience Bradley Saya had been performing for online for 4 years, it does not. The Sacramento Bee and the Associated Press described it directly as a hand gesture associated with white power. The New York Post called it a hateful symbol. Local Northern California Public Radio noted the ambiguity. But the people in the courtroom, the family members of Robert Johnson and Jacob Cody Hull, the reporters, the deputies who had walked him in, saw the gesture for what it was. It told the room that the 18-year-old who had just been arraigned for the murders of 2 strangers was not contrite. He was not ashamed. He was performing. The community of online strangers who had spent 4 years cheering for this exact thing. He had walked into a library and killed 2 people for them, and in his first appearance in front of a judge, he was letting them know he was still one of them. The district attorney's office formally charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Each count carried a firearm enhancement that, on its own, could add 25 years to life in prison. Each count also carried a special circumstance allegation, the multiple murder special circumstance, which, under California law, is one of only 2 pathways to a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bradley Sayer did not enter a plea on June 25th. His defense attorney, Roberto Marquez, requested a 3-week postponement to review the law enforcement reports. The court granted the request. The case was continued to July 16, 2026 at 8:30 in the morning for further arraignment and entry of plea. The court also received the prosecution's request to set bail at no bail. The court granted that request as well. District Attorney Mike Ramsey held a press conference after the hearing. He laid out for reporters the timeline of what Bradley Sayer had done, the journal investigators had found, the online community Sayer had been part of, the white supremacist hand gesture in the courtroom, and one piece of news that surprised some observers. The Butte County District Attorney's Office would not be seeking the death penalty in this case. Ramsey told reporters that the decision had taken into account Sayer's age, his autism diagnosis, and his lack of any prior criminal record. The prosecution would instead pursue a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. If Bradley Scott Sayer is convicted on both counts of first-degree murder with the multiple murder special circumstance, and if the firearm enhancements are sustained, he will never leave prison alive. He will be in a California State Corrections facility for as long as he is alive. He just will not be put to death by it. In the hours and days that followed the shooting, the people of Chico did what people in American towns have, by now, far too much practice in doing. They mourned. 3 vigils were held in the days after Robert Johnson and Jacob Cody Hull were killed. The first was held at the Chico Library itself, the building Robert Johnson had called his happy place, the building Cody Hull had walked his little girl into to pick out books. About 100 people gathered on the same lawn the gunman had crossed 48 hours earlier, and they left flowers and notes, and they sang prayerful songs in the dark. A second vigil was held at St. John's Episcopal Church on Floral Avenue, where multiple faith communities, Bidwell Presbyterian, Faith Lutheran, and others, came together to pray for an end to gun violence. A third was held later that week. The Butte County Library System closed all of its branches in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. When they reopened, security personnel was stationed at the entrances. The 7-year-old little girl who had been on the bench with Cody Hull survived. Her physical injuries from crawling through broken glass to get inside the library were not life-threatening. The DA confirmed in his press conference that the shooter had ignored her. He had been focused on his targets and his fantasy. The only thing standing between his shotgun and the 7-year-old on that bench was Jacob Cody Hull. In a Facebook post shared by Cody Hull's family in the days after the shooting, his brother Benjamin's family wrote one sentence that has, since June 22nd, been the line the people of Chico have come back to over and over again. They wrote that Jacob Cody Hull had lost his life while protecting their niece. Benjamin Hull would later tell reporters that he had been notified about his brother's murder at 1 o'clock in the morning. He said he could not sum up his brother's life in 3 sentences or less. He said Cody was his brother. He said he loved him. The family of Robert Johnson in Orland did not give many public statements. They asked for privacy. They left it at this. The library had been his happy place. There is one more thing that needs to be said about this case before we close it. The online communities Bradley Sayre spent 4 years of his life inside are not a Chico problem. They are not a Butte County problem. They are not a California problem. They have existed since the Columbine shooting in 1999. And they have been growing for 25 years. They consist, in some cases, of thousands of young people who treat the perpetrators of mass killings as celebrities. Every once in a while, one of those young people decides to stop being a spectator and start being a participant. Bradley Sayre made that decision on June 22nd. He kept a journal for 4 years describing what he eventually did. That journal sat in a house with his father and his mother and his teachers and his classmates and his life, and nobody saw it until 2 strangers were already dead. If you see a young person in your own life headed down the same road, please do not wait. You do not need certainty. You do not need proof. You only need the willingness to ask one question on one day before someone you have never met has to bury their father. The Chico Police Department is asking anyone who went to school with Bradley Sayre and has information to contact them. The FBI Sacramento Field Office is still working through the online communities he was part of. If you saw something, a post, a message, a video, please call. Robert Johnson, 74, of Orland. He drove 25 miles east on the afternoon of June 22nd to spend a few hours inside a public library in Chico, which was his happy place. Jacob Cody Hull, 46, of Chico. He took a 7-year-old little girl he was raising as a father figure to that same library on that same afternoon to pick out books she loved having him read to her, and a 7-year-old little girl whose name has been kept private and who is still alive because the man raising her took a shotgun blast to keep her that way. That's all we have for you on this episode. Until next time, look out for the people you love and stay safe.